and welcome back to Rushing the Field, National College Football Show. Yours truly, Nicole Auerbach, also joined by Joshua Perry. We are everywhere you get your podcasts and also on the NBC Sports YouTube page if you'd rather watch your podcast. So we are all over the place, and we're going to keep covering this sport throughout the offseason because there's always news, and there certainly was this week. But Joshua, before we begin, for our anyone who's watching us, I just need to point out I'm wearing the Pop-Tarts Bowl Sprinkles quarter zip. And I just feel like my day really, like, it can't be bad from now on. Like I've got the sprinkles on.
I'm filled with jealousy. That's what I'm filled with today. I've got a regular quarter zip on. Shout out Peter Millar. You know, it is boring. This is what suburban dads wear, okay? And that's exactly what I am. But look at you bringing all the fire and the pizzazz. I'm super jealous right now.
Did you see that there was a great joke about Peter Millar? Did you see that tweet? That was like, your man wears Peter Millar. I wear the Pop-Tarts Bowl quarter zip. We are not the same. Like, we are that meme in real life right now.
Drove a stake through my heart because I have a closet full of Peter Millar quarter zips. They're the most comfortable thing that I have. And I think they look fine if I'm wearing them out or whatever. But I saw that and I'm like, oh man, I'm super lame. Like this is lame.
Yeah. I like how this like touched a nerve, but not the old man candy or all your other like 80-year-old type takes.
Was it?
I know. You think you can dress well, and here you are without the Pop-Tarts quarter zip.
It's not necessarily dressing well. It's just, I felt like I was getting by. I'm not too much of a schmuck when I wear this, right? Like I don't look like a bum. I know I'm not dressed up. It's not elevated, but the kids called me out on socials.
Yeah, you're not part of the culture, the monoculture right now.
Unfortunately.
Which is the Pop-Tart Bowl. Which, by the way, before we get off the subject, my friends at the Pop-Tart Bowl also sent me a prayer candle for Frosted Strawberry, who died but then was resurrected this year at the Pop-Tarts Bowl. So they really they have the marketing down to an art. Yeah. And it again, like our plea every single year is we need more edible and food brands to get involved in bowl season. Like there's so much you can do with it, as evidenced by the Sprinkle Q-Zip. But Joshua, we do have actual news to discuss. Like we said, we're going to be here throughout the offseason. We're going to have a bunch of great interviews with some of our friends and some former players, coaches across the sport all offseason. But we're still wrapping up news. Really like coming out of the national championship game, because we talked about this briefly, but both of the participants in the national championship game need new defensive coordinators. So let's start with the one that left Columbus for State College. Jim Knowles officially announced at Penn State. The salary is crazy. Like he's going to be making $3.1 million per year, first $3 million coordinator in the country. And this is just such an interesting move, leaving the team that just won the national championship less than a week after winning said title to go to Penn State, the team that they are chasing. This is the team that is chasing Ohio State, that is trying to close the margins and to figure out how to go from being very, very good to elite, how to go from reaching the national semifinals to the national championship game. A team and a program where everyone kind of pushed all their chips in, like Ohio State did last year, like Michigan did 2 years ago, with a bunch of returning players coming back. Drew Aller, Katron Allen, Nicholas Singleton, a bunch of key players on both sides of the ball. And that's where Jim Knowles decides to go. Pennsylvania guy, talked about his ties to dream of really going to Penn State, didn't work out. But he decides to go there. He decides to leave Ohio State, which is built to compete for national championships every year, to go to a program that we've wondered if they would do this, that if they would invest the same resources that the top programs in college football do. And here they go, and they create the first $3 million coordinator. So Joshua, a lot of different angles to attack on this. But let's start with the Penn State impact, like what it means that Penn State was willing to pay this, was willing to go out there and try to poach Jim Knowles.
I mean, that's the part for me that stands out the most, is their willingness to pay $3.1 million a year. And they had kind of hinted to different people in our industry, through media appearances, like listen, we're getting everything lined up. We're very serious. It's like a far cry from whining about the runway out in State College. But like, James Franklin wanted them to invest the way that other schools had done it. And I think the university said, we can do that for you because we want to win a title as well. So this stands out to me as more of a symbolic thing. Here's the reality from a football standpoint. I don't think this makes a damn bit of difference. Penn State's defense was never really the issue. Tom Allen didn't leave because he had a bad defense. He left for an opportunity that he probably felt was a bit more of a culture fit, maybe closer to family and the whole deal. But this idea that they needed to overhaul a defense and they had to go out and make the splash higher on the defensive side, I don't know if they needed to pay $3.1 million to do it, right? But they did. So I expect them to be good defensively once again. That was the biggest signal to me. Outside of Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, Denai Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, outside of all those guys saying, we're running it back for one more, it was this, all right, well, you know what, Jim Knowles, he's not exactly happy. This is one of our rivals in conference that we've struggled to beat. Like, he's looking around. Let's go get him, and let's make him not only the highest paid coordinator in college football history, but let's blow that number out of the water. Ohio State was ready to pay him $2.75, which would have been the highest paid coordinator in college football. And Penn State said, screw that. We're not even going to make this close.
Right. And it was a sweepstakes, right? So you had Ohio State still in the mix. You had Oklahoma in the mix, yep. And then you had Penn State. And so it is, to me, like the bigger thing of, to your point, like your defense was going to be good no matter what. It's always a strength at Penn State. You always have great athletes and they're able to succeed. It's the statement of saying, we're going to go do this. We're going to go get the coach from our rival. We're going to go get the coach who just played a national championship game. And there's going to be no reason that he's not going to pick us, right? So we are going to spend the most. We are going to offer him the most. We are going to give him control of the defense, whatever he wants, right? I don't think he was announced with a position, right? So I think he can just do coordinating. He can be in any meeting he wants. Like, he doesn't have to worry about different things. And I think that that's the statement. The statement is, this is a place where James Franklin, to your point about the runway, has complained about the resources, right? Like, it's been about facilities, and they're obviously upgrading them and have upgraded some. It's been about NIL and support, right? And obviously people stepped up. These guys are coming back next year. Nobody left. People didn't hop in the portal. Nicholas Singleton did not test the waters. So the people have responded and they have answered. And certainly coming off of an appearance in the national semifinals, great time to do all of this. But it's about alignment, which is such a buzzword in college football. But like James Franklin has talked about it with his president, his athletic director, Pat Kraft, who's only been there for a couple of years, by the way, and him, and that they have been able to get these types of things done. And to push them through. They prioritize the things in football that you feel like you need to prioritize. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like, it's Jim Knowles. He's the best coordinator in the country. He had the #1 defense in the country. Sure, all of that's nice, but it's that you went and got him, not necessarily that it's him. And obviously, once we get closer to the season, like, it will matter how he is installing the defense. But right, for winning the offseason, for like us talking about this right now, and for the fact that this has been in the headlines for, a week now, it's because Penn State was willing to do it.
No doubt. No doubt. It's, again, they've put themselves in that spot where I think people are going to do the national title or bust for Penn State.
They already are. Yeah.
And I do want to caution people. I feel like that is a really miserable way to live a college football season because it makes everything else not matter. But they have done the things that we watched the last 2 national champions do. And so I think that the expectation now with James Franklin, again, I think people try to do this, he's a bad coach thing. And I push back on that and say he hasn't won the games against teams that he's not supposed to beat, but he typically beats who's supposed to beat.
He does.
Well, now you have the roster. Now you have the resources. You went and got your defensive coordinator. You have the offensive coordinator that you wanted last year. He's running it back. Like, it does feel like it would be time. If they're going to do it, this year feels like the year they should do it.
2 questions for you. 1, does Penn State have the best pair of coordinators in the country?
Wow, that's a really good question. I would wait and see from the standpoint of who does Ohio State go and get as their DC? Because what
True.
Chip Kelly did, especially in the postseason, and if they go out and they make a splash with the DC, I think it would be neck and neck for those two.
Okay, but I mean, like, that's what we're talking about here with what Penn State has, because the way that we talked about them going and getting Jim Knowles is the way we talked about them going and getting Andy Kotelnicki last year.
Yep.
This is someone who, the creativity, the offense is Kansas turning them around, and then he stays with Lance Leipold until it's Penn State, until they were able to go get him.
The interesting thing is Jim Knowles and Andy Kotelnicki obviously have history from coaching against each other in the Big 12. Kotelnicki's offense has struggled against Jim Knowles'
right, the only defense they really
but imagine like now you get to have that conversation. Hey bro, here's the secret sauce. This is why we were so good against you. Like there's this thing too about the better your staff gets, the more you're able to self-scout and you're able to improve from a scheme standpoint, from a practice standpoint, like elevate when you put together a staff that has really, really good coaches like this.
Yeah, I agree. And also you're taking away like one of your biggest weakness, like your kryptonites from your rival and putting them in your staff that you get to learn from and not have to face. So that's part of it as well. The second question I have for you, and we'll come back to Penn State because we want to talk a little bit about some of these way too early top 25s, which Penn State is very high on. Have they fixed the receiver issue though? Right? We talked about all the things that they're running back. Are they going to be able to fix the most glaring weakness, the receiving room?
They brought in a transfer from USC. There was another transfer, I think might have been a G5 guy that they were pretty high on. So maybe. I mean, they had guys.
The spring portal window as well. You still have another opportunity.
The spring portal, I feel like, is one of two things: is guys who know they're not going to start at their school, so they're just out, or you're poaching. You're poaching. So if they want to go out there and they want to do what teams are doing that might be a little nefarious, they could probably get a splash in the spring, but I don't know if there's going to be that real top tier talent there. It's going to have to be a combination of the guys that they did identify in the portal are really good, and that makes a difference. And then maybe some guys who we didn't see play this year. Caden Saunders is a guy who I've heard about, local to Columbus. So I know a little bit about him. They had high expectations. Does he take a step? Like, can you get some of that going too? That's going to be my biggest thing because you can't just throw it to the running backs all game and feel like that's going to be your pass game.
Let's flip this over and look at what's happening at Ohio State, right? So not surprisingly, you win a national championship, people are after your coaches. There have been reports that Chip Kelly is interviewing with the Houston Texans, or at least interested, or there's interest from the Texans. There certainly could be more as the NFL coaching carousel continues to spin. They do need a defensive coordinator. Lost Jim Knowles, which I think stunned a lot of people just nationally, maybe not in Columbus as much, but the idea that you just reached the mountaintop and now less than a week later you want to leave. What's wrong there? So I guess I just wanted your perspective on kind of the state of Ryan Day's staff and where they could go for a DC, but also just like, was that shocking to people in Columbus that Jim Knowles wanted out or was willing to leave?
So I think the conversation starts with whenever you win a title and whenever you have players that look the way that Ohio State's players look, people are going to be coveted, right? Like your staff is going to people are going to attempt to poach one way or another. We saw with the roster, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, both offered huge NIL packages to leave Columbus. I'm sure there were other players that were in a similar boat. Like these are things that happen when you win a championship. Typically, it is a position coach that is going to take a coordinator job elsewhere. Typically, it is a coordinator that is going to take a head coaching job elsewhere. What we don't often see is a lateral move, a coordinator to coordinator in college football. You can make an argument that if Chip Kelly left, it's not really a lateral move because he'd be stepping up to the NFL. But again, it's coordinator to coordinator. For Justin Fry, who took an interview with the Chicago Bears, the offensive line coach, who did a phenomenal job for Ohio State. We talked about that offensive line in the state that it was. Josh Simmons getting ready to be a first-round pick. Donovan Jackson, All-American guard, kicked out to tackle. He's going to be a first-round pick. Seth McLaughlin, people thought he forgot how to play football at Alabama just this time last year. He was an All-American Remington Award winner. Did a great job. He's looking at a lateral move. It's the NFL, so a step up, but for a same position. It does feel weird. Now, for Jim Knowles specifically, I do think it came as a surprise because it's like lateral move to Penn State, the in-conference team, which, by the way, we did see Tony Alford take the running back job at the University of Michigan last year, lateral move to the rival.
Yeah.
It feels strange here. Money was certainly a factor, but that wasn't the reason why. Ohio State allegedly was getting ready to make him the highest paid coordinator in college football. So I don't know if it was this consternation about how much of Jim Knowles' defense he got to run. Does he feel like maybe when things went wrong on defense, Ryan Day was a little bit tougher on him because that's not his side of the ball than he would be on the offensive guys when things weren't going well? I'm not exactly sure, but there's also this guys are looking. They're looking. And so maybe Ryan Day, for as good of a coach as he's proven to be, is a little bit tough to work for. And I played for a guy who was very difficult to work for. I know coaches couldn't wait to get their opportunities to go elsewhere when it was Urban Meyer running the program. And that's what happens when you have high standards, and Ryan was under a ton of pressure. So I totally get it. But like this, it feels like more than just other opportunities that make sense for some of these moves that are getting ready to be made.
Yeah. And we'll see, right? And we'll see, who they replace them with and all of that. Like there's still so much to come in Columbus. And we'll again get to some early prognostication. It's like, what is the word? Prognosticator.
That's a big word. That's a University.
It's a big word. I know it is a University of Michigan word, but I should know how to pronounce it. We'll get to that when we talk a little bit about early looks at next season, about what people think of this roster and team, even despite departures and possible staff changes. So we'll stay on all of that. We'll flip it over to Notre Dame because obviously they were also in the national championship game. Al Golden immediately left for the Cincinnati Bengals, and they are closing in on a deal with Chris Ash, former Rutgers head coach and longtime defensive coordinator, to be their next defensive coordinator. You and I both know him and have covered him, especially when he's at Rutgers in the Big Ten. And I think that, to me, this feels really similar to the Al Golden hire. And by the way, Notre Dame's had an incredible run of defensive coordinators, like the last four, like all complete hits. All have moved on to great jobs afterwards. And it's been quite a run. But Al Golden, like, part of the way that people were talking about him this year was as this like resurgence and for his career, his reputation, all of this, because it took a hit after it didn't work at Miami as a head coach. And so it feels similar with Chris Ash. It's a familiar name, but the last time we saw him as a head coach, it didn't work, but he's still a great defensive coordinator, great defensive mind. And you bring in someone who has head coaching experience, who's coached at a lot of different places in high pressure situations, and they can come in. And I think it's a good hire. I think that, especially for the fact that you have to make it at the end of January, options might be limited, or maybe you can't get in as early as someone who decides to stay where they are for another year. But I like it. And I think that, with what worked with Al Golden is the template of what can work with Chris Ash again as well.
I'm totally there with you. And to touch on kind of like the parallels between the two, as you mentioned, both former head coaches, things didn't work out for them. I think that's a benefit to Marcus because these are the guys that can tell him what not to do, right? Like, hey, when I was doing it, like maybe we stay away from this. And I think that's really good to have. They're also Al Golden and Chris Ash, both guys that spent time in the NFL as well, coaching in that league. And so you learn how to coach a little bit differently when you do that. You also learn some different scheme things from the next level. So I think that's a big positive to them. It's interesting looking at some of the reaction on social media from this move. Chris Ash at Rutgers, like that was a full, like you got to tear it down and try to build it back up. And he is a guy who has uncompromising standards. He is a guy who is committed to honesty. And, he's a guy who like very technical, does it a very specific way. And I don't know if everybody loved that, right? Like, I don't know if that is for everybody. It worked for us when he was DC at Ohio State. He came in 2014, immediately turned us around and had us winning a national title. And so from my perspective, I think this is really good. And Notre Dame's guys can handle somebody who is very honest, and they can handle the type of pressure that he's going to put on them because it's Notre Dame football. And this is what they're used to. And those guys go there for that very reason. I'm excited to see this. I talked to Chris Ash yesterday, as a matter of fact, and I told him, like, listen, man, ready to cover you, like, super excited about it. And we had a good chat. He's a great dude. He's a phenomenal coach. He can elevate every part of that defense, which was already playing well. And that's no shade to Al Golden, because I thought he had those guys humming. But that's just how much I respect Chris Ash.
Absolutely. Other news, a couple other bits of news that have popped this week since we last chatted, Joshua. On Thursday, news broke from our pals over at ESPN that ESPN, it's always weird when ESPN writes articles about ESPN deals. ESPN has agreed to continue to pick up its option to continue broadcasting ACC sports through 2036. This is something that we've all been following. We actually learned about it in Florida State's lawsuit against the ACC last year, that there was a look-in, and that, you know, that deal didn't actually go all the way through 2036. It could have ended in 2027. This is something that I've had a lot of conversations with administrators about. You know, does that nullify the grant of rights? Would it then end in 2027? Does that spark realignment? Well, this is a critical step, right? ESPN is the ACC's primary media partner, and they were trying to stabilize as a conference and trying to keep Florida State and Clemson in the fold. And this is also in the ESPN report. The television deal settled. ACC now working towards a settlement with Clemson and Florida State that could end their ongoing lawsuits against the conference. So this has been percolating for a few months now. But the idea that Clemson and Florida State could end up staying in the ACC, that maybe the grass isn't greener, or there isn't options for them, or it's just way, way, way too expensive to try to get out of the grant of rights and the ACC's deal, and that there was a possibility that they could work it out and figure out how to stay in the ACC. It felt like for a time, Joshua, that was not a possible outcome, because again, there was lawsuits and the things that people were saying around lawsuits or in the lawsuits. But certainly now looks, as we sit here on January 30th, 2025, like the ACC may have stabilized itself and may have figured out a way to keep its biggest brands in the fold, which is so, so important when you think about the CFP moving forward, and you think about keeping up with the Joneses, aka the SEC and the Big Ten moving forward. You needed Clemson and Florida State in the conference, and you also needed the conference to have its long-term future secured, because, as we know, realignment decisions and a lot of movement tend to happen around the ends and the new starts of media deals. So this is significant. We've been waiting for this type of update from the ACC and ESPN, but if they're locked in together through 2036, that certainly affects the entire landscape of college football right now.
So first off, any deal that's like a 20-year deal is crazy to me.
It was, it really deserved more scrutiny at the time when it was.
I know,
announced.
Like, what are we doing? But that's neither here nor there. My biggest question, I guess I kick this back to you, is for Florida State and Clemson, are they going to be satisfied with the payout? Like that seems like the big point of consternation for them, is like, we got to get our money up. Does this deal, I know it locks in the grant of rights, but like, how are they going to feel about everything?
Well, so that's part of this article as well, that there is, in these discussions between the ACC and Clemson and Florida State on their revenue distribution model, which, has to do with closing the gap, right? And the ability, like if you go to the CFP, if you continue to advance, you bring in more money. There is part of this proposed plan, which is something Florida State has been pushing for, a brand fund, that money would be distributed to schools that annually generate the most revenue for the conference in football, men's and women's basketball. So Clemson, FSU, Miami, and North Carolina are the ones that are likely to be in that top of the pyramid, according to ESPN. So I think that that's the win, right? That's the part that they were asking for all along, was that we invest more. We bring in more value in these deals. You're putting, us in those primetime positions and the opportunities to get more eyeballs. but we're not bringing in more money than everyone else in the league. And this has been an issue in the ACC. It's a league that has like very, it's like a wide spectrum of how people approach athletics and which sport they care about most, right? This has always been like the tension in that league between basketball history and football driving the way. And so I think that is a huge win if that ends up being implemented into the revenue distribution plan in this conference, because those are the schools that are saying we've invested in the sport that drives all of this, but we're not getting rewarded for it. And that's really what they wanted. And that's why, in Florida State's lawsuit, which I remember when it got dropped in my lap and it was, reading through it all for the first time, a big part was like, here are our viewership numbers. Here is our brand value, and we're not getting any credit for it. So I think that that's a big part of this. But I do think for the larger landscape, there's still realignment that has to happen for the Pac-12 and for the Mountain West. Like they need to get to certain amounts of football playing members. But everyone's been watching the ACC now for 2 years. Everyone's wondered if it was going to break open. And if this is a way for it not, this is just such a huge win for ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips, who was in a really, really tough spot, didn't have a great hand. But if he is able to really stabilize things and to keep everyone together, keep your biggest brands in there and figure out a way to compromise to get all of that done, that's huge. That's huge for really the whole landscape, but for anyone who doesn't want the sport to just become about the SEC and the Big Ten.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Realignment, I'm kind of over at this point. So
I think we all are.
Yeah. So it'll be good to at least know that like this thing is going to be this thing for the, foreseeable future here.
Yeah. Another interesting bit of news this week, our pal Ross Dellinger over Yahoo Sports had a report on Michigan's response to the NCAA about the Connor Stalions case. So this one, as we all know, these things take a long time. They're contesting the facts of the case, right? They're not going to do a negotiated resolution where you admit fault and you accept and kind of negotiate with the NCAA for the penalties, which I think should come as no surprise since the Michigan folks were ready to go to court. They're fighting their commissioner. There's a lot happening with this as it was unfolding a season ago. So there was 137 pages in this document. They pushed back on different allegations of wrongdoing. They were defending Jim Harbaugh. They're defending Sharon Moore. They shed light onto some of the text messages with Sharon and Connor Stalions that were deleted and then recovered and submitted to the NCAA over the period of time. There's like 52 messages that were initially deleted. Some of them were about specific things that Connor Stalions noticed, right? Of Michigan State does this, Nebraska does this, et cetera, et cetera. Schools pushing back saying that, they had all of this documentation from him and other coaches he talked to, where he was saying he was getting it from TV feeds and sky cams and all these different angles, right? So they're arguing that what he's been accused of is not actually what happened and that things were extra salacious, the frenzy, the media coverage, et cetera, et cetera. So that's Michigan's side of this. There was also an interesting tidbit about the tipster, because everyone had wondered where the NCAA got the information, but also just like the direction. Hey, look at Michigan, look at this guy, Connor Stalions, and look at what he's doing with this impermissible on-campus scouting scheme. And according to this document, Michigan believes that the tipster came from Ann Arbor. They're saying that
Ryan
the
Day's
unnamed
brother?
source, which the NCAA has not disclosed, appears to have worked at the school at one point. They believe the confidential leaker was used by the NCAA to produce at least some of the charges in the notice of allegations, and they're concerned about that. So that's an interesting wrinkle. Would love to get more information about that by the time we get to the final chapter of this story. The next step is, there'd be a hearing with the Committee on Infractions, and they're contesting it. So this takes a lot longer, but they have an opportunity, the folks directly involved, to defend themselves and continue to make their arguments. But listen, I don't think anyone's surprised that Michigan is fighting all of these allegations. I don't think it's a surprise that they are defending that, like they're saying the other coaches, we're not involved. Very few of them were even aware of it. There were a couple comments made about like this, your little scheme or whatever, to Connor Stalions, dismissing it, that it's not worth doing. He tried to have someone drive to Georgia to potentially watch a Georgia game because they could potentially have played them in the college football playoff. And people are like, absolutely not. Do not make a low-level manager or someone do that. Like there's a lot of downplaying in this report. And that makes a lot of sense with what Michigan's facing, especially the fact that Sharon Moore, Jim Harbaugh, a couple of these folks could be repeat offenders because of the COVID area recruiting violations. All that to say, it's very interesting because, we're getting an insight into how they plan to fight the allegations there as well. But it's nowhere near the end. So we still don't know, how the NCAA feels about this. Well, we have a better sense of it because we've seen the notice of the allegation. Like we know what they're alleging here. But I don't think it should come as a surprise the way that Michigan is attempting to defend itself and deflect and say that some of these charges feel a little bit trumped up because of the sensational nature of the scandal.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing here. I'll start by saying I think Michigan's actually playing this right, because the further they get away from this, I think the less relevant it is in people's minds. And so the longer timeline, I think there are more people that are like, either it wasn't that big of a deal or I just want this to be done. Right. And so I think they're benefiting from that in terms of the court of public opinion, which is a very interesting thing here. I also like 6 level 1 infractions that they're alleging here. It feels like something that you should not just take a negotiated resolution on. I think it is something that you should fight, because if you're the AD or if you're the administration for Michigan, 6 level 1 infractions, they're going to come in and try to slap you with all kinds of punishments. And like, you're just going to sit there and say, oh, we're cool with that. Like, no, I think the right thing is to try to fight it and say, oh, we stand by our guys. But I do think one of the most interesting things here is there is certainly a tone shift from he was a lone wolf to, well, actually, we kind of had guys discouraging him. And like, we knew to distance ourselves a little bit from this guy because he was kind of doing some stuff. And it's like, okay, so was he a lone wolf and nobody was aware? Or were you guys aware that this dude was acting in a nefarious manner and you just were kind of trying to push it to the side? But you knew what he was bringing was valuable and you were using it on game day. That's the interesting thing. Obviously, there are facts of the matter and things that you can and cannot prove. But there's a tone shift, certainly to me, that's happened here from lone wolf to, well, we just kind of told him to go play in his corner over there.
Well, and also like that does become a problem with the NCAA, right? Because like knowing but not acting, not reporting things become violations. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this goes. I think your point about just kind of dragging it out and fighting it is the right strategy here. Yeah. We have seen in recent years, like with Tennessee and some other cases where like if the school is really cooperative, they can avoid some of the heavier penalties. We don't know what kind of penalties are on the table here for Michigan. I was in the room with Charlie Baker, the NCAA president. We all were at the convention about a week after, actually, no, just a couple of days after Michigan won the title, beat Washington. And he said that he was defending like the NCAA getting involved early and giving information to the Big Ten, allowing them to act, which of course they did, and suspended Jim Harbaugh. And said that allowed them to believe that, like he said, that he didn't think anyone watched that championship run and didn't believe that they won it fair and square, right? Because the information was out and they got rid of, Stalions was not on staff, and Harbaugh, the advantage of having a head coach like that was not there for a couple of weeks. So it's interesting. I think it would be hard for them to come down super, super hard after the NCAA president says something like that. But we don't know. We don't know exactly where it's going. We don't know what kind of penalties are on the table. And it's going to be interesting as this continues to get fought, because it took forever for the recruiting violations case to reach a conclusion. This could still take some serious time. And when you have a coach or multiple coaches that are no longer in college, you can do show causes. You can say if you come back, you're have to be suspended for multiple years. But ultimately, those aren't penalties with much teeth.
Right. And I do think too, from Charlie Baker's standpoint, he was in an impossible position with Michigan winning. And I felt like I had this conversation with a lot of people, but like the best defense for Michigan was to win that championship after all the penalties that they did have that were kind of unprecedented. But I feel like it's a really tough spot to discredit your champion. I always say it's the most important thing in the sport. And so right after the game, saying that it's fair and square, I think is the right thing to say, because you don't want to discredit it. But there's this part that you have to reconcile with when you have the case, what you actually do at that point. And, again, we're talking about whatever penalties we have here are going to be an indictment on the 3-year run, but in particular, the championship run for Michigan too. And again, I just asked the question, how much do you want to invalidate one of your champions? It's a really difficult thing to do because championships are the most important thing.
Yeah. So we'll see what happens there. But again, not a surprise. Michigan is fighting, and that this is going to be contested, which puts it on a different track. It does take a lot longer, and there's a hearing with the Committee on Infraction. So still more chapters to go in the Michigan saga. And we will see what ends up happening in retrospect to that national championship run and that basically the end of the Harbaugh era at Michigan. One last thing before we go, Joshua, on a lighter note, everyone's been putting out their like way too early top 25 rankings. We're going to have a lot of time this offseason to dive into, how we feel about different teams and what their rosters look like. But the interesting one that I want to get your perspective is ESPN's way too early top 25 has Ohio State at number 1. It goes Ohio State, Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Georgia as the top 5. Ohio State's losing a lot. Yeah. We don't know for sure who the quarterback is going to be next year. There could still be more staff turnover. Are you a little surprised that the expectations are that high for a potential repeat?
No, I mean, I feel like this is what we do every year is like, oh, whoever won it last year, we're just going to put them at 1 or 2 or whatever. When we do our way too early top 25. And certainly when the AP poll comes out and coaches poll, it's probably going to feel similar as we get closer to the season. I'm with you. I in good faith wouldn't put Ohio State at number 1 at this juncture because there's so many questions. As you mentioned, who's calling plays on defense? Is Chip Kelly going to be back to call plays on offense? Defensively, I think they're losing 8 of their starters. Guys are just going to be like out of the program now. Something like that. Like it's a lot of turnover to replace there. Quarterback is a question. I think people believe in Julian saying we don't know. So yeah, I mean, I have questions about Ohio State compared to some of these other teams. I think the thing that people are banking on here is the recruiting and development, right? Like they're just going to be able to reload, which we've seen them do, no doubt. And the fact that we just watched them win a championship, it's really hard to ignore that Ohio State might be sitting right there next year.
Yeah. And I do wonder, I'm sure everyone will, kind of revise these as we get through spring ball and closer to the season. What the impact of not really being able to be active in the December portal window, how that could possibly impact the team. I think we all learned a lot about that with Michigan last year. So we'll have to see what happens there. The other interesting piece is Penn State at 3. I have seen people make a case for Penn State as the number 1 preseason team coming into next season for all the reasons we talked about at the top of the show with everyone that's coming back. 3 feels better to me, and it feels like a little bit less of a bullseye on your back because, like you said, Joshua, I feel like the idea of a national championship or bust, especially for a coach that hasn't won one and a program that hasn't played for one in a while, like that's a lot to ask. But 3, like a top 5 preseason ranking, like that feels right. It feels right for Texas. It feels right for Notre Dame and for Georgia. Everyone expecting them to bounce back, certainly. But I think like if you're Penn State fan, I think you're a little worried about all the nice things everyone's been saying about you. It's a lot of compliments, a lot of pats.
It's a weird spot. Yes, I'm totally there with you. I think Penn State fans are like, we haven't felt this. Like this is not a good place.
I think they're like, please stop saying all of these nice things. Yeah.
And I will say too, like the other part, and it's hard to ignore, like these kids are on social media and they see all the graphics out there of people doing this too. And it's hard to ignore it. And sometimes it does seep in. So they've got a bit of a job to do in terms of insulating their team from all the compliments. I think 3 is fair to your point. Like we can make the number 1 argument. We can make a number 2 argument here. But as we just mentioned, there is that question about what their offense is truly going to look like from a throw game perspective. I think they're going to be really good. Texas is the one that I wouldn't fight people if they said that's the number 1 team on these way too earlys, because I think we're all confident in Arch Manning. Steve Sarkisian has proven to us as well in back-to-back years that he's a legit ball coach. Like there was that, how much are we going to believe in Sark? Like I think we got to stop asking that question and just believe in the guy. They're going to be losing a little bit at wide receiver. Wingo, the freshman, phenomenal. I like them. They should be right there by the end of the year. But these way too early top 25s, I think we might need to stop engagement farming on content because these are kind of crazy.
They are, especially like with when the portal is still going to be open, when there's still changes that are coming. I really feel like these things become even more outdated than they used to be, because like you used to be returning a lot of players. Like you kind of knew what these teams were going to look like. And now, you're kind of basing it on who you think is going to be quarterback. Like, are there high profile guys who are coming back? Like South Carolina is the preseason number 10 in this way too early. Like I buy that. I think that's like an interesting pick. Sure. And I am intrigued because I want to watch Lenora Sellers. I think they had a great season. They were kind of right on the cusp of making the CFP. That's interesting. Clemson at number 7, really interesting as well, because you're bringing back Cade Klubnik, who's going to be one of the best quarterbacks in the country. You've got to think. And
defense should be fixed as well for Clemson, by the way.
Great point.
Yeah. Like I think that's an interesting one too.
Yeah. So like there's cases to be made for all of these teams, and we'll do deeper dives in the rest of the off season onto some of these top programs. But I think if I had to vote right now, I think I would go Texas 1.
I would say so. I think it makes the most sense here. Like it's hard for me to argue the teams that are in the top 5.
Yeah, I think it's the right order 5.
Yes, I agree with that.
And then there's still questions about Notre Dame.
Yeah, I know.
Quarterback. Like there's a lot. Like
they
people are
a ton of young guys though.
They did. No, and they were banged up, right? So you're assuming guys will come back, be healthier. Yeah. People were freaking out about the offensive linemen who were entering the portal. Like again, guys became starters because of injuries. Yep. There's still a lot of guys coming back. Like, so there's so many questions still with some of these teams, even in the top 5. That we kind of need answers. And also the rest of the staff, you need to figure out some of the stuff for some of these top teams as well. So we'll continue to cover it all. Again, still lots of news to come. And certainly there's always something in college football each week. We may be off around the Super Bowl as you guys get your NFL fix, but we'll be here anytime there's major news. And then, of course, we'll be back throughout the off season as well. So for Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach. Thanks for hanging out with us, and continue to subscribe, rate, and review us here on Rushing the Field. We'll talk to you soon.